Buenas noches. I took a group of students with me to Cuernavaca in Mexico for the purpose of learning from the poor and learning about who God is. That evening, when we began to unpack what we saw, one of the students looked at me and said, I know they're struggling. I know it's horrible, a lot of suffering. But when I looked into the eyes of that little girl, I saw the hope in her eyes. Now, at that moment, I had an epistemological meltdown. And what I responded, maybe not very pastoral, was, I'm not sure what you saw in her eyes, but in 5 years, she's going to be turning tricks to put food on the table. She will be in poverty, her children will be in poverty, and her children's children will be in poverty. There's a generational suffering, and you imposing hope upon her saves you from your responsibility and your connection to why she lives in poverty. Because of our global economic structure, she lives in poverty, and you living in the first world benefits by her poverty. Not very pastoral. I have come to learn that hope is a way of maintaining oppression among those who suffer the most. Hope becomes a way of domesticating those who are suffering. When I went to Auschwitz, there's a sign above the gate that says, work will set you free. It provides hope for those walking through those gates. But no, and if you walk through those gates, you might believe that if I keep my eyes down, if I don't say anything, if I try not to stir the pot, maybe I'll survive. But the end result is the same. You'll probably end up in the gas chambers. You see, hope of maybe surviving allows me or constricts me not to make waves, not to do the radical praxis that is needed in order to bring about liberation. Now, what I'm saying is counterintuitive. I mean, after all, the gifts of the spirits is love, joy, peace, and hope, and here I am talking against hope. But if I'm going to be in radical solidarity with the very least of these, my brethren, they're the ones that are sitting in the Saturday, not knowing if a Sunday resurrection would occur. And for me to sit with them and start saying, all things work for good for those who are called according to God's purposes, is not only disingenuous, but it really is lost in any type of translation. Now, my problem is that I don't hope in English, I hope in Spanish. See, in Spanish, hope is esperanza, which is from the root word esperar, which means to wait. You see, we Latinos realize that to esperar, esperanza, means that we're waiting, but we're not sure what we're waiting for. It could be good, or it could be bad. So we are just esperando. And this ambiguity of hope, which I think the English language loses, is what I'm trying to grasp in the work that I am doing. Hope seems to only work if we narrow it down to the personal. I'm sure you've been to some church where some pastor says something about a little girl on the beach after a storm, and there's a bunch of starfishes, and she's throwing each one back one by one, and there's a grumpy old man on the beach, and he says, you can't save them all, and she picks one up and says, I'll save this one, and throws it back, and we go, okay. I'm the grumpy old man on the beach, okay? Because what I'm seeing is the carnage of all the dead starfish. But as long as I could put one on a pedestal and said, one made it out of the barrio, one made it out of the concentration camp, one made it out, and one made it, then I could ignore the thousands of dead bodies that are on that beach. And I apologize, but the stench of rotting flesh has been so much that it has choked any hope out of me. If I'm going to be in solidarity, I have to be in solidarity with those thousands of starfish. So a little theological now. I think the problem with hope is that we have bought into Hegel's dialectical history, that somehow history is moving in such a way that you can see God's hand in it, and it's moving in an upward way. We call this a salvation history. We see this in both capitalism, that, at the end of history, a rising tide lifts all ships, and we see it in Marxism, that we're going to wither away the state, everybody's going to live in utopia. Salvation history is a product of the whole modernity project. I've been perverted by Foucault, in where he instead talks that there is no linear dialectical history. That is, things could be going great today. Next generation, we could go back to Jim and Jane Crow, we could go back to slavery, or we could go to a more enlightened. It depends on each generation and what they do with their time. So if there is no, and I love Martin Luther King, and I apologize, but I think he's wrong when he says that the arc of the universe bends towards justice. I argue there is no arc. And it could bend towards justice or injustice just as easily. But if I believe that there's a dialectical history, then I could have hope that it's all going to work out. You see what I'm saying? And I think Moltmann's trying to make this point in where he's looking at the end of history and saying, oh, okay, now that we're at the end of history, we could look back and we could see all those horrible things, they had a purpose. But I'm arguing there is no purpose to a Holocaust, to slavery. There is no purpose. It's just horror. And that's part of our humanity. And I want to embrace that. Primo Levi, who did go through Auschwitz, says, there is no God, only Auschwitz. I want to understand what it means to get to that point of desperation that you can't even accept a God that allows Holocausts to occur. Okay, that is what it means to be in radical solidarity with the least of these. So, here's where I think Christianity could become problematic. Rauschenbusch, in his social gospel, Rauschenbusch talks about that empires, like the Assyrian Empire, was horrible. It grinded so many people under it. But it allowed civilization to move forward. See, I have a problem with that if you're the one that's being grinded by empire. So history becomes, I think, whatever the historian who gets to write the history say history is, to justify the power of the dominant culture who happens to be living by the fruits that history has produced for them. Okay. History, well, let me put it this way. Every once in a while, Jesus shows up in a tortilla someplace. Now, there's been studies done that our brains are designed to see faces in static images. In other words, if there's no face in it, but we're told there's a face there, we will see it even though there is no face. I would argue that history, which is also static, our minds are designed to see order into this disorder. We see the face of Jesus in a history where that face is not located. Ecclesiastic, vanity of vanities, all is vanity, everything is meaningless. Where is God in all this? To quote the great modern theologian, Woody Allen, in his movie Husbands and Wives, he has a character, he plays the character of Gabe Roth, who is watching TV, and he hears that famous quote from Einstein, that God doesn't play dice with the universe. The Woody Allen character turns off the TV, walks away, and says, no, God does not play dice, God plays hide and seek. How do I embrace a God who plays hide and seek with the universe? A God to whom Jesus cries out, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? A God who really appears somewhat sadistic with Job, that on a bet with Satan decides, let's see how much destruction we could bring into the life of this righteous person. And at the end, when you're trying to find a reason for this, God replies, it's none of your business. Now we could say, well, yeah, but God blessed Job with new riches and more cattle and a new family. But anyone who ever lost a child, no matter how many new kids you may get, will never replace the lost ones. How do I wrestle with this God? See, the Hebrew God had a dark side that we in Christianity seem to ignore. It is God who brought evil spirits unto Saul, according to the Bible. You have to think about that. God brings evil spirits unto Saul. Isaiah says, if good or evil enter into the village, is it not God who brings it? God brings good and evil. I don't understand that. See, I'm not a theologian, so that's okay. I'm an ethicist. But as an ethicist, I need to try to figure out what is the moral agency in a universe where God is not as predictable as my theologian friends want God to be. In a world that's not as predictable, in where there's going to be an end where everything's going to make sense. How does one operate in an ethical way in such a world and with such a theology? See, the embracement of hopelessness rejects quick fixes. Now, I think one of the problems when we think of hopelessness, we think of despair. And despair is horrible. I mean, despair, I just want to roll up into a fetus position and cry. But hopelessness is not despair, it's desperation. And there's a big difference. When a migrant decides to cross the desert, it's not an act of despair. It's an act of desperation, even though they know they probably will die. And as a side note, every 4 days, 5 brown bodies die crossing the desert in this country. Probably the greatest human rights violation occurring since the days of Jane and Jim Crow. And yet, it barely makes the news. So, if I'm going to be in solidarity with the least of these, how do I understand what it means to decide to cross the desert knowing that death is a good possibility? Now, don't get me wrong. Every once in a while, I come across somebody who says, oh, yes, I was crossing the desert, and the Virgin Mary appeared to me and led me along the way. And I say, hallelujah, amen. I'm not going to start talking about hopelessness. But I have to ask, you made it. What about the other 5 people every 4 days who don't make it? That's where I'm at. That's what I'm trying to wrestle with and understand. I find solace in Unamuno, a Spanish philosopher, who talks about being an unbelieving believer. In other words, he chooses God because he really has no other choice, and that's probably the best choice. But at the same time, he wrestles with this God who he chose, which happens to be a God he just doesn't understand. And sometimes I find myself holding on to any type of faith simply by my fingernails. And that's okay. And that's fine. And God's not scared about that. She puts up with a lot of me. Now, I seek not answers that would lead me to the correct doctrines. I think doctrines is probably the worst thing that could ever happen to Christianity. I seek correct actions, correct praxis that could be employed that fully makes society aware of the injustices that are occurring. See, as a good liberationist, I really don't care what the doctrine is, because we're all wrong anyway, and when we get to heaven, we're going to find out how wrong we all were. What's important is the correct praxis. What is it that we are doing that manifests the gospel in everything we do? Francis of Assisi once said, or he's supposed to have said, preach the gospel every opportunity you have, and when all else fails, open your mouth. So, I'm half blind. How much time do I have? 5 minutes. Oh, okay. I'm doing good, except for this. So, embracing hopelessness. Neoliberalism has won. Racism is on the rise. The poor are going to get poorer, the rich are going to get richer. I mean, just reading the newspaper shows you how screwed up we are. Now, I could go ahead and come up with all kinds of religious platitudes to make us feel good. Or I could simply realize that in the face of this global oppression, I embrace it knowing that the goal is not to win. Okay? I usually tell my students, do you do justice because you think you're going to win? Or do you do justice for the sake of justice? You see, if you're going to win, everybody jumps on the bandwagon. I mean, literally, if you know you're going to win, everyone all of a sudden has been part of the struggle. But when there is no hope of winning, do you still struggle for justice? Do you struggle for justice because you expect a reward at the end of the battle? Or do you struggle for justice for the sake of justice? Let me put it away. What's the life expectancy of a social worker nowadays? 6 months to 3 years? Then they go into real estate, right? Okay. Why? Why? Because they enter with this belief that they're going to change the world. And then they realize how screwed up the world really is, and they're not making any change whatsoever. But if instead they were to embrace the hopelessness of the situation and realize they're not the savior, and realize it doesn't depend on them, maybe they would last longer. I've been working in immigration justice now for over a decade. And it's getting worse. This DACA, students may be, young kids may be sent back to Mexico. They may not. I don't know what the future is. So it is getting worse. I'm not burnt out because I don't do the justice thinking somehow I'm going to win and make a difference. I do it because it defines my humanity. My praxis, my actions, is what defines who I am as a human being. And it defines who I am as a Christian, or a Jew, or a Muslim, or a Hindu, or whatever faith tradition you're part of. It defines our very humanity. So, what is the response? I have been developing what I call an ethics para joder. Now, for those of you who know Spanish, I want to apologize in advance, because this is a certain word that you never use in polite conversation. It's equivalent to a certain English word that has 4 letters long, begins with F, ends with K. I only curse in Spanish, not in English. When you're not going to win, when all the social structures are against you, all that is left is to screw with the systems. Not to screw the systems, but to screw with the systems. See, I'm borrowing this idea, which I think Christianity has lost, but is very much in the Hebrew Bible, this idea of the trickster. The idea of the trickster who constantly is creating chaos in the hopes that new opportunities may arise that may lead to greater understanding or even justice. In my own Latino background, from the Caribbean, we have this the worshiping of the orishas. And one of the orishas is El Egua, which is the trickster. And I'm embracing El Egua in doing my ethics because I really believe that playing the trickster can bring about change when it's hopeless. It may not. But again, like I said, it really doesn't matter. We're the only society that drives to a march. Think about that. We're the only society that has to go to the police department to get a permit from the police department to protest the police department for police brutality. You see, we can protest as long as we do it within the space that has been chosen for us by those in power. So we could go, we could carry our signs, and then we could do all that fun stuff, and at the end of the day, nothing changes. What I'm advocating by jodiendo is what Jesus did, which is go into the temple and overturn the tables of the bankers and mess with their entire system. Yes, that may lead to crucifixion. Not that one should ever seek it, but it could lead to it. So, to end, I am advocating an ethics that shows us how to lie to get to truth, that shows us how to cheat to be able to save lives, that teaches us how to steal in order to feed the hungry, how to constantly be joking to say the hard truths that we just can't hear, how to be deceptive in order to reveal what is true. Hard stuff. And it could only be done in community, never by an individual. And that's important, which I don't have time to get into. So, thank you very much. I'm glad I taught you a new curse word in Spanish, jodien. And we'll see you later.